Once upon a time, in a small, sleepy town where the past seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog, there stood a little ice cream shop called Blackwell's Creamery. The shop was tucked away on the corner of a narrow street, its once bright sign now weathered by time and neglect. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The shop, like its owner, had been around for generations, its history woven deeply into the town's fabric, yet still largely ignored by the people who passed by every day. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. Marcus Blackwell stood behind the counter, his dark hands skillfully scooping ice cream into crisp, white cones. His face was a mixture of pride and weariness, and his eyes flickered between the door and the windows, always anticipating the next harsh whisper or judgmental glance from the townspeople. It was early afternoon, and the town was quiet. Most of the town's residents were too busy with their daily routines to stop and enjoy the small joys life offered. But on this particular day, a newcomer named Riley Thompson wandered through the town's narrow streets. He had recently moved from the city, looking to leave behind his past mistakes and start anew. He wasn't familiar with the town's unspoken rules or its long history of segregation, but something about the little ice cream shop intrigued him. Riley pushed open the door of Blackwell's Creamery, the bell above it ringing softly. Inside, Marcus looked up, his eyes narrowing as if measuring Riley's every step. It wasn't unusual for strangers to enter, but they rarely stayed long. "How can I help you?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet and guarded. Riley smiled, a warm and genuine smile. "I'll take a cone. Something simple, vanilla." Marcus nodded, scooping the ice cream with the practiced motion of someone who had done this for decades. Riley took a seat by the window, savoring the quietness of the shop. Outside, he noticed that very few people walked by, and when they did, they barely glanced at the shop. Some even crossed the street to avoid it. As Riley ate, Marcus leaned against the counter, looking out the window himself. There was a heaviness in the air, something almost invisible but very real. The town, despite its picturesque charm, was burdened by something much darker, a long-standing hatred that Marcus knew all too well. Despite the quiet, there was an undeniable tension here. It wasn't just about the ice cream, it was about Marcus's presence in the town, and Riley was beginning to sense it. The next day, Riley returned to the shop, curious about the place and the man who ran it. As he stepped onto the worn wooden floor of Blackwell's Creamery, he felt the weight of the silence in the air. This time, however, as he stood there, he noticed something different. There were more eyes watching him. Eyes from the windows, eyes from across the street. People lingered, but no one came inside. Riley ordered a cone, and Marcus handed it over, his face unreadable. Riley didn't take a seat this time. He walked up to the counter instead and tried to make conversation. "You've got a really nice shop here," Riley said, trying to break the silence. "How long have you been running it?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. His eyes scanned the street outside as a group of townsfolk approached, their voices low and murmuring. When they reached the door, they stopped abruptly, glaring at Riley. One of the older women, her lips curled in a sneer, leaned in and whispered, just loud enough for Riley to hear, "Don't waste your time here, stranger. That place belongs to him." She jerked her head toward Marcus, making it clear who him referred to. Riley froze for a moment, not understanding the full weight of what was happening. He felt the coldness in the room, as if the walls themselves were closing in. But before he could respond, the group shuffled away, muttering under their breaths. Marcus didn't flinch, though his shoulders tightened. Riley stared at him for a moment and decided to say nothing. He paid for the ice cream and left, but the woman's words echoed in his mind. That place belongs to him. Later that afternoon, Riley found himself wandering the town square, still uneasy from the strange encounter. He approached the old town hall, a large stone building that seemed as if it had stood for centuries. Inside, the town historian, Mr. Jameson, sat behind a dusty desk, sorting through old papers. Riley, seeking answers, introduced himself and asked if he could learn more about the history of the town. Mr. Jameson, a wiry man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, looked up, surprised at the question. "You're new here, aren't you?" he asked, his voice warm but cautious. "I am," Riley replied. "I'm just trying to understand the town. I was at Blackwell's Creamery earlier and—" Mr. Jameson's expression changed immediately. He put down the papers and looked at Riley more seriously. "You're asking about Marcus Blackwell, I take it?" the historian asked, his voice growing softer. Riley nodded, intrigued. Jameson leaned back in his chair. "Marcus's family has been in this town longer than most people care to remember. His father opened the ice cream shop many years ago, and for a time, it was a popular spot. But things changed when the town became more divided." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "Marcus's family is black, and in this town, that's not something everyone's happy about." Riley frowned. "But the shop's been here for generations, hasn't it? Why would people—" "Because of him," Mr. Jameson said quietly, referring to Marcus. "Because of who he is and where he comes from. The town has never fully accepted the Blackwell family, not like they have others. There's always been tension. It's easier to pretend the shop doesn't exist than to acknowledge the man behind it. But Marcus has never given up. He's fought to keep it alive." Riley sat back, taken aback by the harsh reality of it all. "Why hasn't anyone told me this? Why hasn't anyone helped him?" Mr. Jameson's eyes softened. "Because not everyone is as willing to fight for him as you might think. People get comfortable with their prejudices. And sometimes, comfort is harder to break than silence." Riley left the town hall that afternoon, the weight of the town's history pressing heavily on him. The quiet tension he had sensed earlier was no accident. It was part of something much deeper and more painful, a divide that had been in the town long before he arrived. That evening, Riley walked back to the ice cream shop. The evening air was crisp, and the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the town in shades of deep purple and orange. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car rumbling by. Inside Blackwell's Creamery, Marcus stood behind the counter, cleaning the metal scoops in the glass case. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost mechanical. He glanced up when Riley entered but said nothing. Riley hesitated before speaking. "How long have you been running this place?" he asked, his voice casual, but he couldn't hide the concern in his eyes. Marcus didn't look up, but there was a slight change in his posture. 23 years. Riley blinked. "And you've been alone all that time?" Marcus paused, his hands stilling as he thought about the question. "Not always, but always fighting alone." Riley didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded. The room was thick with silence, and for the first time, Riley understood what it must feel like to be in Marcus's shoes. A man, running a small business in a town that refuses to acknowledge him as equal, trapped in a cycle of loneliness and struggle. "I don't get it," Riley said after a moment. "Why stay here if it's this hard? Why keep going?" Marcus's eyes met his for the first time, and there was a quiet fire in them. "Because this shop is my father's legacy," he said firmly, "and it's my fight now. If I walk away, they win." Riley swallowed hard. He could see now that this wasn't just about ice cream. It was about dignity, respect, and survival. The following day, Riley returned to Blackwell's Creamery with a new resolve. He stood at the door for a moment, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. Marcus was behind the counter again, his face unreadable. Riley walked up to him, a slight smile on his face. "I've been thinking," Riley began. "I want to help you. I think this shop deserves more than what it's getting. You've got something special here, Marcus. People just need to see it." Marcus raised an eyebrow, not saying anything immediately. "I don't know how, but I want to help you make it better. I can help with the marketing, the shop's appearance, anything you need." Marcus looked at him, silent for a long moment, then spoke quietly. "Why would you want to help me? People like you don't do things like this for people like me." Riley's smile softened. "Because I believe in fairness, and I believe you deserve more than what this town gives you. No one should be forced to fight alone." Marcus took a deep breath, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, but don't expect things to change overnight." Riley nodded back, determined. "I didn't expect it to." As Riley worked alongside Marcus over the next few days, He quickly realized just how deep the town's hostility ran. When he tried to put up a sign outside the shop, it was torn down by local business owners. When he spoke to a few of the townsfolk about Marcus's ice cream, they responded with cold, dismissive remarks. But Riley didn't give up. He made a plan to modernize the shop, to bring in new customers, and to let people know that Blackwell's Creamery was open for business. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead was long, but Riley was determined. And so, the first small steps toward change began, not in big moments, but in little acts of courage, each one a challenge to the deep-seated beliefs that had kept the town divided for so long. As the sun set behind a small ice cream shop, Riley paced back and forth inside Blackwell's Creamery. The walls were still dark with age, and the flickering neon light outside cast a pale glow across the counter. But the smell of fresh ice cream hung in the air, rich, creamy, and inviting. It was a good product, but Marcus's shop wasn't getting the attention it deserved. Riley was determined to change that. "All right, Marcus," Riley said, walking over to the counter where Marcus stood, staring out the window. "We need to start thinking bigger. More people need to know about this place. I've got some ideas, simple, but they'll get people talking." Marcus turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "I don't know how much good that'll do," he said with a shrug, clearly tired of fighting an invisible enemy. "People in this town don't care about a black man's ice cream shop, no matter how fancy the sign or how nice the social media posts are." Riley shook his head. "You're not seeing it the right way. People want to know they're supporting something real. And this shop is real. We're going to show them that. We'll start small, revamp the look of the place, run some specials, get a few local influencers to try the ice cream." Marcus wasn't convinced but nodded anyway. "I've heard it all before, Riley. There's no winning here." Riley didn't back down. "I don't believe that. And I'm not going anywhere until we prove that wrong." The next morning, Riley arrived early, armed with supplies. Fresh paint, a stack of flyers, and a notebook filled with ideas. He stood back, assessing the exterior of the shop. The faded sign was the first thing to go. Riley painted a fresh, bold new sign that read, "Blackwell's Creamery. Ice cream as sweet as family." Marcus watched from the doorway, his arms crossed. "You think this is going to change anything?" he asked skeptically. Riley turned, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of optimism and determination. "It's a start. It might not change everything overnight, but we have to start somewhere." The work continued through the day. They painted the walls a bright, welcoming color, replaced the rusty stools with newer, more inviting ones, and posted flyers throughout the town with catchy slogans like, "The best ice cream you've never tasted." By the afternoon, they had a fresh look, but Marcus wasn't sure if it was enough. When they posted a discount for the first 50 customers, Riley was hopeful. He wanted to see people walk through the door. But as evening set in, only a few passed by. The town seemed indifferent. The following morning, Riley and Marcus stood inside the shop, staring at the once vibrant new sign, now the target of cruel words. Someone had spray painted over the shop's name, "Stay away." Riley's heart sagged. "We can't let them do this to you, Marcus," he said, clenching his fists. Marcus let out a weary sigh. "This is nothing new. These people don't want me here. They never did." Riley frowned. "Well, I'm not going to just stand by and watch. We need to keep pushing." They spent the rest of the day cleaning the mess off the sign. But as they worked, Riley realized the true cost of trying to break down barriers. Every attempt felt like an uphill battle. That afternoon, a group of local business owners approached the shop. The owner of the hardware store, a burly man with a red face, was the first to speak. "I don't know what you think you're doing, Thompson," he said, glaring at Riley. "This town doesn't want change. You're bringing trouble by associating with him." Riley was stunned. "What do you mean by that?" "You know what I mean," the man replied. "You want to stay here? You better stay away from that shop. It's not welcome here." Riley's fists clenched at his sides, but Marcus stepped in quietly. "Don't waste your breath, Riley. Some battles aren't worth fighting in their eyes. And even if they were, we wouldn't win." Riley turned back to Marcus, defiance burning in his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere." The weeks that followed were a mixture of setbacks and small victories. Riley refused to let the discouragement weigh him down. They used social media to share photos of the shop, posted testimonials from a few customers who had been brave enough to stop by, and even offered free samples at local events to build awareness. One afternoon, as Riley stood behind the counter, a woman walked in, someone who had never stepped foot in Blackwell's Creamery before. She was a mother, around 35, with 2 young children in tow. They looked up at the brightly painted walls and the fresh signage with curiosity. Riley greeted her warmly. "Welcome to Blackwell's Creamery. What can I get for you today?" The woman looked at the children, who were already scanning the menu with excitement. After a brief moment, she turned to Riley. "You've done a great job with the place. It looks different. I've been avoiding this shop for a while, but I'm willing to give it a try now." Riley smiled, not wanting to pressure her. "You'll love it. Fresh ingredients, homemade flavors." The woman chose a cone, and as she paid, she smiled at Marcus, who was standing in the back, looking slightly surprised. "Thanks for keeping this place open," she said. "We could use more businesses like this around here." It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Later that night, after the shop closed, Riley sat in the back room, going over the finances. The shop wasn't turning a profit, far from it. The hours of hard work and the effort to get people to come in had barely put a dent in the overall problem. The town was still deeply resistant to the change that Riley and Marcus were trying to create. Riley ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. He had tried everything. Keeping bold, keeping patient, and he'd done everything he could to change the narrative. But it seemed like the town wasn't ready. Marcus entered the back room quietly, observing Riley's exhausted demeanor. "I told you it wasn't going to be easy," he said softly. "I thought I could change it," Riley replied, his voice tinged with doubt. "I thought if I worked hard enough, the people here would listen. But it's like trying to move a mountain. Every time we take a step forward, they push us 2 steps back." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He sat down next to Riley, his gaze thoughtful. "Sometimes, Riley, you have to fight when you know you won't win. It's not about changing their minds. It's about doing what's right, regardless of the outcome." Riley glanced at Marcus, still unsure. "But what if it's just too much? What if we're fighting something we can't change?" Marcus gave him a quiet smile. "You don't know until you try. The shop might not change overnight, but you can't give up. Not now." Riley nodded, taking in Marcus's words. Maybe Marcus was right. This wasn't just about running a business. It was about something deeper. About standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. The following week, Riley returned to the shop early one morning to find the front door splattered with red paint. Dark, ominous letters scrawled across the door. "Leave now or else." Riley's stomach sank, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at Marcus, whose face remained calm but whose eyes told a different story. "I guess this is the real test, huh?" Riley said, forcing a chuckle to hide his unease. Marcus didn't laugh. "You can leave if you want, Riley. This town won't change. Not like you think it will." But Riley stood tall, his resolve hardening. "I'm not leaving. This fight is just getting started." Marcus looked at him for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. Then, for the first time in a while, he smiled. "Well, I suppose if you're staying, we better get to work." And with that, they began cleaning the paint off the door, ready to face whatever came next, together. The days after the incident with the red paint were a strange mixture of hope and fear. As Riley worked diligently on the shop, scraping off the remnants of the spray paint and tidying up the storefront, Marcus quietly observed from behind the counter. The threat had shaken them both, but neither of them was willing to back down. The news of the vandalism spread through the town quickly, and it was clear that the community was split. While a few people, like the woman with the children, continued to visit the creamery and express their support, many others took to the streets in anger. Local businesses, especially those that had been hostile to Marcus from the beginning, began to speak out. Whispers of outsiders and troublemakers spread through the town like wildfire. Riley stood in front of the shop one evening, watching the flow of people pass by. Many of them looked away, purposefully avoiding eye contact with the creamery. Only a handful dared to enter. It was a stark reminder of just how entrenched the town's prejudices were. "Looks like the message is clear," Riley muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. Marcus joined him outside, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the street. They'll never change, Riley. The hate here runs deep. It's always been this way. Riley clenched his fists. I don't believe that. There are still people who care, who want to make things better. We just have to find them. A few days later, Riley was in the middle of wiping down the counter when the doorbell jingled. He looked up, half expecting more regulars to walk in, but instead, it was someone he hadn't expected at all. Sarah Williams, a longtime local schoolteacher and one of the town's few white residents who hadn't openly distanced herself from Marcus's business. She was carrying a small cardboard box filled with flyers and pamphlets. Without a word, she placed them on the counter, catching Riley off guard. I've been spreading the word, Sarah said quietly, her voice steady but firm. Not everyone in this town feels the way those other people do. We have to stand up for what's right. Riley blinked in surprise. Wait, you're willing to support us? Sarah smiled faintly. I can't speak for everyone, but I know what's right. I've seen how hard you've been working. And it's not just the ice cream, Riley. It's about standing up for Marcus. For justice. Marcus, who had been silently observing the exchange, looked at Sarah with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. You're the first person in a long time to stand up for me. Sarah nodded, her expression softening. Sometimes, it's the quiet ones who make the most difference. She handed Riley the box. Pass these out. Tell people to stop being afraid. It's not a crime to support a good business. And I'll be talking to my colleagues at the school. We'll help however we can. Riley was momentarily speechless, but he smiled. Thank you, Sarah. We won't let you down. By the end of the week, things began to heat up. Riley's hope for a shift in town sentiment seemed to fuel something darker. A few nights after Sarah had offered her support, a group of teenagers, likely encouraged by the adults in the community, began to harass the shop. They would drive by and shout insults, throw trash in front of the door, and even occasionally throw rocks at the windows. One evening, Riley was inside, arranging the flavors, when a loud crash shattered the calm of the shop. He rushed to the front and saw a group of young men running down the street, their laughter fading into the distance. One of the windows had been broken. Riley stood frozen, heart pounding. It felt like a breaking point. One more attack on Marcus, on the business, on the dignity of both men. He turned to Marcus, who was standing behind him, arms crossed. Marcus wasn't angry, though his face was full of quiet resolve. I've lived through worse, Riley. Don't let this stop you. Riley clenched his fists, looking out at the damage. I'll fix it. I won't let them win. Word of the latest attack spread quickly, and by the next day, more townspeople came forward to offer support. Among them was Bob Miller, a former mechanic who had been friends with Marcus's father. Bob, though a man of few words, had always been a quiet presence in the town. He had kept his distance from the issues of race and segregation, but he couldn't ignore the injustice any longer. He showed up at the shop with tools in hand, ready to help Riley fix the window. Bob didn't say much as he worked, but his presence alone was a powerful statement. Your father taught me a lot, Marcus, Bob said after a long silence. He always believed in doing the right thing. I reckon I owe it to him to keep this place standing. Marcus stared at him, his face softening. Thank you, Bob. I didn't expect this. Bob gave a small, knowing smile. I didn't expect it either. But I don't want to see this town fall apart over something like this. You're a good man, Marcus. Your father was a good man. This shop deserves better than what it's getting. Riley watched the exchange with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in days. Maybe there was more support out there than he realized. Maybe the tide was turning, even if only a little bit at a time. As the days passed, Riley grew more and more committed to making a stand. He had seen the ugliness that permeated the town, but he had also seen the quiet courage of those willing to help, like Sarah, Bond, and the few brave souls who supported the shop in spite of the pressure to conform. One evening, Riley stayed up late, drafting a letter to the local newspaper, hoping to get the word out about what had been happening at Blackwell's Creamery. He wrote, in a town where the fight for equality has always seemed like a distant dream, there's a small ice cream shop that's holding on, against all odds. This shop, owned by Marcus Blackwell, is more than just a business. It's a symbol of perseverance, of dignity, and of what it means to stand up for what's right, even when the town tries to tear you down. I'm asking my fellow townspeople to look past the color of the man behind the counter and see the man himself. The Blackwell family has been a part of this town for generations. It's time we acknowledge that. He took a deep breath before sending the letter to the editor. Riley's letter was published the next day, and though he had hoped for some positive response, the backlash was swift and violent. Angry calls came flooding into the shop, people shouting their hatred for Riley, for Marcus, for everything they stood for. The town seemed to be closing in, and it felt like the last few months of hard work were about to be swallowed by the hate that had always lingered. But something unexpected happened in the days that followed. The next morning, a few local families that had kept their distance before, showed up at the creamery, not just for ice cream, but to offer support. They didn't speak much, but they quietly paid for their cones, sat down and left, showing solidarity in their silence. Then came more calls of support. A local church, whose pastor had long remained neutral, spoke out publicly about the importance of unity and fairness, rallying members to support Marcus and Riley. The next Saturday, a community meeting was called at the town hall. The townspeople were divided, but there was a noticeable shift in the air. The divide was still present, but so was the determination to see something change. The battle was far from over, but Riley felt something different now. Something in the air was changing, even if it was just a whisper. The following Saturday, the town hall was packed. The air inside was thick with tension as both sides of the town's deep divide faced off. On one side, a group of residents, mostly older men and women, stood with folded arms, glaring at the other side of the room, where a small but growing group of younger people, allies, and a few brave locals who had started supporting Marcus's creamery sat, nervously shifting in their seats. Riley stood by the door, watching as Marcus entered the room, his posture stiff, but his eyes full of quiet determination. They had agreed it was important to show up, to stand their ground, and to have a voice in a community that had tried to silence them. The meeting began with the town mayor, James Hawthorne, taking the stage. He was a tall, imposing man in his 50s, with graying hair and a stern face. He looked out over the room, his eyes lingering on the new faces near the back of the room. "Let's keep this simple," Mayor Hawthorne said, his voice booming. "We all know why we're here. There's a problem in this town, a problem that's dividing us. I've received complaints from businesses, from people who've lived here all their lives. People aren't comfortable with the changes happening around Blackwell's creamery." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Riley's heart pounded, but he stood tall beside Marcus, ready to speak. He raised his hand, and with a reluctant nod from the mayor, he stood up to address the room. "We're here because it's time to stop hiding," Riley began, his voice unwavering. "This isn't just about Marcus's ice cream shop. It's about what kind of town we want to be. A town that allows hate to rule, or a town that stands up for what's right." The room fell silent. "Yes, the shop's been a symbol," Riley continued, his tone growing more passionate. "But the real issue is that it's been a symbol of fear and division. If we can't stand behind something as simple as good ice cream, then what does that say about us?" He paused for effect, letting his words sink in. "People are afraid of change," Riley said softly. "But what's really at stake here isn't just Marcus's business. It's the heart of this community. It's the kind of future we want for our children. Do we want a town that embraces diversity and kindness, or one that clings to hate because it's always been this way?" A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others remained stone-faced. But Riley could feel the tide starting to shift. The mayor's face was red as he slammed his hand on the podium. "This town has always had its ways, Riley. We've done just fine without all this liberal nonsense." To use the words like an insult, emphasizing the syllables as if the very idea of change was something filthy. "You're asking us to accept something we're not ready for," the mayor barked. "We've got people who've lived here their entire lives, and you expect them to just change their minds because you've decided it's time for progress?" Riley stepped forward, unwavering. "No. I'm asking you to think about what kind of people we want to be. I'm asking you to look at the values you teach your children. Does the color of someone's skin really matter when it comes to buying ice cream? Does it matter when it comes to making this town a better place?" His words hung in the air. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, an unexpected voice came from the back of the room. Sarah Williams, the schoolteacher who had shown support for the shop. "I agree with Riley," Sarah said, standing up. "I've been teaching here for over 20 years. I've watched our children grow, and I've seen the way they've been taught. This town's kids, our future, are watching us. They see the division. They see the hate. They see us turning away from doing what's right." Her words hit harder than anyone expected, and several people in the crowd shifted uneasily. For the first time in a while, the resistance felt like it might falter. As the meeting raged on, an unexpected figure walked into the room. It was Bob Miller, the quiet mechanic who had recently helped with the window repairs at the creamery. His large, calloused hands clutched a piece of paper. "I want to say something," Bob announced, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. He took a step forward, standing beside Riley and Marcus. "I've lived here a long time, and I've seen this town grow, seen it change. My father didn't believe in much, never had much hope for a town like this. But he did believe in fairness, and he believed that a man's worth isn't decided by the color of his skin or where he comes from. It's about the choices he makes. It's about the kind of man he is." He paused, glancing over at Marcus. "I knew Marcus's father. He was a good man, and I know Marcus is a good man. This town wouldn't be the same without him." The room went silent. Some of the older men who had been outspoken against Marcus's shop now seemed uncertain. Bob's quiet conviction had reached them in a way Riley's words hadn't. He was one of them, someone they respected. And if Bob could stand by Marcus, maybe there was hope. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. Riley and Marcus took turns speaking, answering questions, and pushing back against the narrow-mindedness that had defined the town for so long. For every person who spoke out against them, there seemed to be someone else willing to stand up for what was right. By the end of the meeting, the mayor stood again, visibly exhausted and defeated. He glanced around the room, his gaze falling on the few people who had shown their support for the creamery. "We'll see what happens," the mayor muttered. "But I'm telling you, the road ahead isn't easy." But Riley wasn't listening to the mayor anymore. He was looking around at the people who had stepped forward to stand beside them. They weren't just allies. They were the town's future, and the future was starting to look brighter. The next few days brought more unexpected changes. More people, both locals and newcomers, began to visit Blackwell's creamery. Some came to support Marcus, while others simply came for the ice cream. But either way, it felt like a small victory. The creamery was slowly starting to win over the town, one visitor at a time. Sarah Williams, who had been a vocal advocate for the creamery, arranged a local school event at the shop. It was a simple gathering, ice cream for the kids, games, and activities, but it was an undeniable show of solidarity. Even the school's PTA started supporting the shop by purchasing ice cream for events and encouraging other teachers to do the same. And then, the local newspaper ran an editorial. It was a quiet but powerful piece, acknowledging the strength of the community's divide but also calling for unity. It didn't outright condemn the town's past, but it asked the people of Blackwell to consider their future. Riley stood behind the counter that afternoon, serving a steady stream of customers. He looked at Marcus, who had a quiet smile on his face. They had made it through the hardest part, but they both knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. As the sun set, Riley and Marcus stood outside the shop, looking at the horizon. For the first time in a long while, the future seemed uncertain. But it was a different kind of uncertainty. It was a challenge, yes, but it was also filled with possibility. "Thanks for sticking with it, Marcus," Riley said, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. "We've come a long way." Marcus gave a small nod. "You've done a lot more than I ever expected, Riley. But this isn't over. We've made a dent, sure. But there's still a long way to go." Riley smiled, determined. "I'm not going anywhere. Not now." And as the evening lights of Blackwell's creamery flickered on, it was clear. The real fight had just begun. The weeks following the town hall meeting were a whirlwind of mixed emotions. There was a small, quiet victory in the air. The town seemed to be slowly waking up. Blackwell's creamery was receiving more foot traffic, and there was an almost palpable shift in the energy around Marcus's business. However, the change came at a cost. Riley sat at a table in the back of the creamery, pouring over the books. The numbers didn't add up. While the shop had gained some new customers, the underlying tension remained. Local businesses that had supported the status quo still refused to engage. A steady stream of rude messages, online and over the phone, threatened the shop's continued existence. "How are the numbers looking?" Marcus asked, leaning against the counter, his voice low. Riley shook his head, frustrated. "It's better than it was, but we're still struggling. Even with all the support, it's not enough to cover everything. The old guard won't let go. They're trying to starve us out." Marcus let out a heavy sigh. "I always knew it would be tough, Riley, but seeing it firsthand, it doesn't get any easier." Riley stood up, determination in his eyes. "We knew it wouldn't be easy. But it's not just about the money, Marcus. This town needs to change, and we can't give up now." Marcus paused for a moment, looking at Riley carefully. "We've come this far. You're right. Giving up isn't an option." As the pressure to survive grew, Riley and Marcus knew they had to do something bold. The ice cream shop had become a symbol, but it needed more than just people passing through. It needed something that would make it impossible to ignore. One evening, Riley came up with an idea that could either break the town's resistance or backfire completely. "I think it's time we hold a town-wide event," Riley said. "Something that brings everyone together, shows them that this place isn't just about Marcus's ice cream. It's about family, community, and unity." Marcus raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "A town event? That sounds like a setup. People are already on edge. You really want to push them like that?" Riley leaned forward, his voice firm. "No, I want to bring them together. We've done everything by the book so far, trying to change the narrative with small steps. Now we need to show them, not tell them. We'll bring in food, music, and invite everyone. All races, all families, all backgrounds." Marcus thought for a long moment, rubbing his chin. "It's risky. What if we make it worse?" Riley didn't flinch. "We'll never know unless we try. If we can't bring them together here, in this small town, then we've got nothing left. But if we succeed, it'll change everything." Marcus slowly nodded. "All right, let's do it." The weeks leading up to the event were filled with frantic preparations. Riley and Marcus went door to door, passing out flyers and personally inviting local families to the Unity Day at Blackwell's Creamery. They enlisted Sarah to help, and Bob Miller brought in his old truck, offering free rides for those who couldn't make it on their own. As the day of the event drew nearer, the pressure mounted. The day before the event, Riley found himself at the local park, trying to secure a permit to set up tents, food trucks, and the small stage for live music. He met resistance from the park administrator, a man who had been vocal about his dislike for Marcus's shop. "You think I'm going to let you host an event in my park, Riley?" the man sneered. "This is a small town. We don't need these kinds of disruptions. Your event's only going to cause more trouble." Riley stood firm. "I'm not asking for permission, Earl. I'm telling you that this town needs this. I'll make sure everything's legal, and we'll leave the park cleaner than we found it." The administrator scowled, but reluctantly handed over the permit. "Fine, but you're on your own if anything goes wrong." As Riley left the office, he realized just how high the stakes had become. This wasn't just about the shop anymore. It was about the future of the town. The morning of the event arrived, and the creamery was buzzing with energy. Sarah had arranged for volunteers to help decorate the area, turning the small parking lot into a lively space filled with bright tables, streamers, and signs that read Unity and Diversity and We Are One Family. Bob Miller had brought in his truck and set up a barbecue station, cooking ribs, burgers, and vegetarian options. A local band, consisting of mostly young people from town, set up near the stage, their instruments glinting in the afternoon sun. But as the time for the event to begin drew closer, Riley began to feel a knot tighten in his stomach. A group of local men, many of whom had opposed the creamery from the beginning, stood off to the side, whispering among themselves. Their gaze was cold, watching every move that Marcus and Riley made. "Do you think they'll show up?" Marcus asked, standing next to Riley. Riley looked out at the crowd slowly starting to gather. "I don't know, but as they do, we'll show them why this matters. We won't back down." At noon, the music started, and people began to trickle in. Some were cautious at first, glancing around to see who else had shown up. But as the first families began to eat, chat, and play games together, the atmosphere shifted. There were children running around, laughing, chasing each other with ice cream cones in hand. People from all walks of life began talking to each other in a way that hadn't happened before. Riley and Marcus moved through the crowd, greeting guests, making sure everyone had what they needed. The air was thick with the smell of food and the sound of music, but it was the quiet moments of connection. People laughing together, exchanging stories, and sharing ice cream that gave Riley a sense of hope. Just as Riley thought things were settling into a pleasant rhythm, a loud commotion erupted near the food trucks. A group of angry men, led by the town's notorious bully, John Stevens, began shouting obscenities. They pushed through the crowd, causing a stir. "Get your filthy ice cream out of here," John yelled, pointing at Marcus. "You're poisoning this town." A few bystanders hesitated, unsure of how to react. The tension escalated quickly. Riley rushed over, standing between Marcus and the group. "This isn't the place for this, John," Riley said, his voice shaking but firm. "We're here to bring people together, not tear them apart. People don't want your kind here." John snapped, his face red with anger. "We've got enough problems without outsiders like you coming in and changing everything." Riley's heart pounded as the crowd fell silent. The fear in the air was palpable, and for a moment, it felt like the event might fall apart entirely. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the older women from the town, Mrs. Thompson, stepped forward. She had been one of the most vocal opponents to the creamery before, but had recently begun coming around. "That's enough, John," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "You've been saying that for years. But this town is better than that. This place, Marcus's Creamery, it's a part of us now, and you don't get to take that away." The crowd murmured in agreement, and soon others joined in. Sarah, Bob, and even some of the younger residents stood in support, surrounding Riley and Marcus. John stood frozen for a moment, his face twisted in disbelief. He glared at the crowd but, realizing he was outnumbered, turned and stormed off with his followers, muttering angrily under his breath. As the sun began to set, the event wound down, and the last few guests filtered out of the creamery. The energy in the air was different now. Lighter, warmer. People were talking to each other, some for the first time, in a way that hadn't happened in years. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Riley stood on the steps of the shop, looking out at the crowd that had gathered. He felt a quiet pride settle in his chest. They had done it. They had brought the town together, if only for a day. Marcus joined him, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You were right, Riley. This might actually work." Riley nodded, watching the last of the guests leave. "It's just the beginning, but it feels like we're finally moving in the right direction." As the lights of the creamery flickered off and the last bit of music faded into the night, Riley knew that despite all the setbacks and resistance, something had finally shifted. And this time, the change wasn't going to be so easy to ignore. The aftermath of Unity Day left a profound impact on the town. For the first time in years, people from both sides of the racial divide had come together, if only for a brief moment, but not everyone was ready to embrace the change. The morning after the event, Riley stood in the creamery, staring at the local newspaper. The headline read, "Town Faces Backlash After Unity Day Event at Blackwell's Creamery." He scanned the article, his heart sinking with each line. The event was covered, but only in the most critical light. The piece focused primarily on the disturbance caused by the group led by John Stevens and painted the gathering as an ill-advised attempt to stir up controversy. The event was described as divisive and unnecessary by several town leaders who had refused to attend. It was clear that, despite the positive interactions during the day, the old guard was not ready to let go. Riley felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He had known the risks, but seeing his efforts reduced to a headline like that was a hard blow. He turned to Marcus, who had come up behind him and was reading the paper over his shoulder. "Looks like we stirred the hornet's nest, huh?" Riley muttered bitterly. Marcus sighed, folding his arms. "We knew it wouldn't be easy, but we can't let this stop us. We've made progress, even if they don't want to admit it." Just then, The door to the shop opened, and Sarah Williams walked in, her face taut with concern. "I saw the paper," she said, her tone tight. "It's not pretty, but we're not backing down, are we?" Riley's eyes met hers, determination flashing in his gaze. "No, not now. We keep pushing forward. We need to show them this isn't just a one-time event. We need to make it clear that we're here to stay." The town's response to Unity Day sent Riley and Marcus into a new wave of determination. The backlash only fueled their resolve to make sure that the message of unity stuck, no matter how much resistance they faced. They began organizing smaller, grassroots efforts, inviting local families, both black and white, to share their stories and build a coalition of like-minded people. Sarah continued to help with outreach, bringing in teachers, young adults, and anyone who might be willing to challenge the status quo. Bob Miller offered to host a community cleanup event, showing the town that they weren't just fighting for a business, but for the future of their community. One evening, while sitting at the back of the shop with Marcus and Sarah, Riley looked out at the empty seats. "It's a slow build," Riley said, his voice measured. "But every time we show up, it counts. People are paying attention, even if they're too afraid to speak up yet." Marcus nodded, but he was still skeptical. "I hope you're right. It feels like we're running out of time. What happens if the town rejects us again?" Sarah, who had remained quiet until now, placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "If they reject us, then we'll keep showing up. You don't win by backing down. You win by showing up, day after day, no matter how hard it gets. And people like us will keep fighting until we make this town see who we really are." Riley nodded in agreement. "We're not just fighting for Marcus's shop. We're fighting for everyone who's felt pushed out, ignored, or hated. And we're going to keep fighting until they can't ignore us anymore." As the days passed, the creamery continued to draw attention. The shop's storefront, once covered in hateful graffiti, was now bright and welcoming. New murals of diverse faces, representing people of all races, had been painted on the walls. More local residents, mostly younger families, began to visit, but the support was still not enough to overcome the ongoing hostility from the town's entrenched leadership. One afternoon, Riley received an anonymous letter that sent a chill down his spine. It read, "We know what you're trying to do, Riley. If you keep this up, you won't have a place to go. This town doesn't want your kind here. Stay away from Marcus, or you'll regret it." It was a threat, one Riley had feared might come, but now that it was here, it hit harder than he expected. He didn't tell Marcus about the letter at first, but it weighed heavily on his mind. It felt like a reminder that no matter how much progress they made, there would always be those who were willing to stop them at all costs. Later that evening, when Riley finally showed Marcus the letter, Marcus wasn't surprised. "I've had my fair share of threats," he said, his voice calm. "But it's different when it's someone who's supposed to be on your side. When it's the people you thought were family." Riley clenched his fists. "It's not fair, Marcus. You shouldn't have to live like this. You shouldn't have to keep fighting just for your right to exist here." Marcus smiled faintly. "You're not the first person to tell me that. But I've made it this far. And as long as you're with me, I'm not stopping." The pressure continued to mount, but one unexpected change came from within the town itself. After weeks of growing unrest, an impromptu protest was organized outside the town hall. It was started by the young people who had seen the division firsthand. Students from local schools, children of families who had attended Unity Day, and a few brave older residents who had been silently supporting Marcus for months. They stood outside the town hall with signs that read, "Unity, not division. We stand with Marcus, and change is here." The protest was peaceful but loud enough that the town could no longer ignore it. For the first time, a majority of the younger people in the town voiced their support for Marcus and Riley. The event was covered in the local paper, but this time, the tone was different. It wasn't framed as a divisive issue. It was framed as the town finally waking up to the need for change. The next day, Riley opened the creamery to find a steady stream of customers coming in, not just for ice cream, but to show their support. Many of them were people who had previously kept their distance, but now they were here, standing with Marcus, and for the first time, it felt like the tide was truly turning. Late one afternoon, just as the creamery was closing for the day, a familiar figure appeared at the door. It was Bob Miller, But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a few familiar faces from the town. People who had once been openly hostile to Marcus and the creamery. "I know it's been a long time, Marcus," Bob said, stepping inside. "But we've been talking, and we think it's time we did more than just talk." He stepped aside, revealing several town residents, some of whom had spoken out against Marcus's business in the past. They were holding boxes of donations, supplies, food for a community dinner, and even a few checks to help cover the shop's expenses. "We may not have said much before," one of the men said, his voice rough, "but we've been watching, and it's time we made things right. The way we've treated you, it's not the way we should have done things." Marcus was silent for a moment, his eyes wide with disbelief. You're serious?" Another person nodded. "We're serious. We can't change the past, but we can help change the future. And right now, you're fighting for something more important than just yourself. We're with you, Marcus." Riley stood behind the counter, looking at the people who had come to show their support. It was a small but meaningful victory, an acknowledgement that not all of the townspeople were lost to hate. The next day, an announcement came that surprised everyone. The mayor, James Hawthorne, called a special town meeting to discuss the current situation in the town. People speculated about what might happen. Would the mayor address the protests? Would he continue to oppose Marcus and Riley? When the meeting began, the room was packed. Riley and Marcus sat in the front row, surrounded by their supporters, with the town's detractors seated across from them. The mayor stepped up to the podium, his face more somber than usual. "We've had some difficult conversations in this town over the past few weeks," he began. "And I know there's been a lot of unrest. People have differing opinions on the recent events, but one thing is clear. We can't continue to ignore what's happening in our community. We've ignored the cracks for too long." The mayor paused, looking around the room. Then, unexpectedly, he turned to Marcus. "I've spoken with several residents, and we've come to a decision. We can't undo the harm that's been done, but we can do better. Blackwell's Creamery has become a symbol, whether we like it or not. And it's clear that this town is divided, about race, about progress, about the future. But I'll tell you this, we can't keep running from it." The mayor looked down at his notes before continuing. "So, I'm announcing that we will work together to establish a town-wide committee to promote unity, support businesses like Marcus's, and ensure that everyone, no matter their background, has an equal voice in this community. It's a start." The room was silent, and then, slowly, the crowd began to murmur in agreement. Riley and Marcus exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement that, while there was still work to be done, this was a pivotal moment. They were no longer fighting alone. And though the road ahead would still be difficult, for the first time, they felt like victory wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Despite the recent shift in town politics, the tension in the air was thick. Marcus and Riley had seen the mayor's announcement as a small victory, but it wasn't enough. Old prejudices were still deeply entrenched in the fabric of the community, and some people, especially in positions of power, were actively working against the changes that had begun. The morning after the mayor's speech, Riley was back in the creamery, organizing the new community center's schedule for the next town meeting. He could hear the murmur of voices outside the shop. Some were positive, some were skeptical. There was still a lot of work to be done to convince the remaining few who held power over the town's future. As he stood at the counter, Sarah came in, her face grim. "You hear about what happened at the council meeting last night?" Sarah asked, not waiting for a response. Riley shook his head, his heart sinking. "No, but I'm guessing it wasn't good." Sarah looked around to make sure no one was listening and lowered her voice. "Some of the council members, especially those close to John Stevens, are pushing for a moratorium on any new businesses in town. They're trying to block any further expansion of Blackwell's Creamery, arguing that Marcus is ruining the town's character. They want to put a stop to everything." Riley slammed his fist on the counter. "They're not going to get away with this. Not after everything we've done. We can't let them drag us back into the past." Marcus walked in, overhearing the conversation. His face hardened with the weight of the news, but his voice remained calm. "Riley, Sarah, what's done is done. We've faced worse. We need to take action, but we need to be strategic." Riley clenched his jaw. "Strategic?" It's war now, Marcus. I don't think there's much room for strategy anymore. Marcus, always the voice of reason, placed a hand on Riley's shoulder. I know it feels like that, but we need to make sure we're fighting the right battles. If we come out swinging too hard, we'll lose the people who are still on the fence. Over the next few days, Marcus, Riley, and Sarah held a series of meetings with their most dedicated supporters. They needed a plan to not only respond to the immediate threat, but also to solidify their position in the town for the long term. The first idea that came up was to showcase the positive impact Blackwell's Creamery had already made on the community. They began gathering data on the shop's financial contributions, how many new jobs had been created, how many visitors were now coming from surrounding areas, and the boost it had given to local tourism. They planned a town-wide event, this time focusing on the contributions of Marcus's business, as well as the other new and small businesses that had started to thrive due to the town's evolving atmosphere. We can't let them paint us as outsiders, Marcus said. We have deep roots in this town. I've lived here my whole life. Riley too. This is as much our town as anyone else's. We're not going anywhere. Sarah added. We need to get our numbers right. We need the media involved. Show them how much Blackwell's Creamery has helped revitalize the town. Not just financially, but culturally too. But the more they talked, the more they realized how deep the divide still ran. They had the support of many new families, but the old guard was proving to be much more difficult to win over. As Marcus and Riley stepped out of the meeting, they were met with Bob Miller, who had been following their efforts from the beginning. You're right, Bob said, looking at them both with a serious expression. But don't underestimate how much influence John Stevens and his group still have. They won't give up easily. They have deep pockets, and they've been around long enough to sway a lot of people. Riley's eyes narrowed. Then we take it head-on. If we can't win their hearts, we'll win the fight with the law. As the week progressed, things began to escalate quickly. One afternoon, Marcus received an urgent call from his landlord. The lease on Blackwell's Creamery, which had always been a standard, renewable contract, was suddenly under review. They're trying to push us out, Marcus said, his voice steady but full of frustration as he relayed the news to Riley. They claim we're not a good fit for the neighborhood anymore. I can't prove it, but it's clear someone's behind this. Riley stood up, pacing. This isn't just about a lease. They're trying to starve us out. They want to break us down, cut off the business, make us leave. And they'll do whatever it takes to make that happen. Sarah, standing beside them, placed a hand on Marcus's arm. You've got a strong case. We just need to keep pushing. We've got the support of enough people now. We've shown that. But Marcus knew this fight was different. The shop might have the town's support, but the landlord's decision carried weight in the legal and financial arenas. The fight was becoming far more complex than just public opinion. It was becoming a matter of survival. To counter the legal threat, Riley and Marcus decided to mobilize the community in a more direct way. They organized a town rally to show public support for the creamery and send a clear message to the landlord that they wouldn't be pushed out without a fight. The night before the rally, Riley walked into the shop and found Marcus sitting alone, staring at a half-finished cone. You all set for tomorrow? Riley asked, trying to read the mood. Marcus didn't immediately answer. He looked up, his gaze distant. I don't know if I can do this anymore, Riley. Every day, it's something else. First it was the graffiti. Then it was the hate mail. Now we've got this. I thought it was just about the business. But it's more than that. They want me gone. Riley sat down across from him. I know. It's been harder than anyone expected. But we've come too far to back down now. Tomorrow is about more than just saving the shop. It's about sending a message. We're here to stay. And we're going to fight until they can't ignore us anymore. Marcus looked at Riley, his eyes narrowing in resolve. You're right. We've made it this far. We've got to keep going. The rally the next day was a powerful demonstration of solidarity. The streets were filled with people, old and young, black and white, waving signs and chanting slogans. The atmosphere was charged with energy, and despite the heat of the moment, there was an undeniable sense of unity. Marcus stood at the front of the crowd, flanked by Riley, Sarah, Bob, and a handful of others from the community. They spoke about the importance of small businesses, about equality and community, and about the deep-rooted ties that bound everyone together. regardless of race or background. Today is not just about Blackwell's Creamery, Marcus told the crowd. It's about every small business, every family, every person in this town who has been told that they don't belong. We belongs here, and we will not be silenced. The crowd erupted in applause. Even the mayor, who had been sitting at the back, stood up, clapping slowly. In the days following the rally, the pressure on the landlord began to mount. A series of news stories about the rally and public support for Marcus and his shop made it clear that the community was united behind them. The landlord, facing mounting legal and social pressure, agreed to meet with Marcus. The tension was palpable when Marcus arrived at the office for the meeting. He sat across from the landlord, who seemed nervous, glancing frequently at his phone. "Marcus, I understand you've got a lot of support," the landlord said, tapping his pen nervously on the desk. "But you need to understand the position I'm in. There's been a lot of talk about you and your business. People in the town are divided, and my investors are pressuring me." Marcus leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "I've been here my whole life. I've built this business with my own hands, and I'm not going anywhere." The landlord sighed and put down his pen. "Look, Marcus, I'm not sure where things stand here, but we're not going to let things escalate further. I'll make my decision soon. I want to keep this professional, but there's no doubt that the community's voice is being heard.